Did you know medieval convents weren't always quiet places of prayer? What if I told you some of history's fiercest power struggles unfolded not in battlefields, but within abbey walls? Get ready to explore 10 incredible moments from the 11th to the 15th centuries when powerful abbesses stared down kings and changed history. Number 10. The Abbess of Quedlinburg and the Young Emperor's Demands. In the year 1000, as the new millennium dawned, the Holy Roman Empire was a vast, sprawling entity, held together by a network of powerful dukes, bishops, and abbesses. At the heart of this web, with immense wealth and political influence, stood Quedlinburg Abbey. Not just a convent. Quedlinburg was an imperial abbey, meaning it answered directly to the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Its abbess was no ordinary nun. She was a princess, a powerful feudal lord, and a significant political player in her own right. At this time, that formidable role was held by Abbess Mathilde, a woman of sharp intellect and unwavering resolve, a granddaughter of Emperor Otto I, the very founder of the abbey. The emperor on the throne was Otto III, a young man, barely 20 years old, with grand visions. He was educated and idealistic, dreaming of a renovatio imperii Romanorum, a renewal of the Roman Empire, with himself at its spiritual and secular head ruling from Rome. To achieve this ambitious goal, Otto III sought to consolidate imperial power, streamline administration, and bring all powerful entities within his realm into tighter control. This naturally put him on a collision course with independent-minded figures, especially those who held vast lands and enjoyed extensive ancient privileges, like Abbess Mathilde. The specific point of contention began to simmer as Otto III initiated a review of imperial domain, the crown lands and properties that provided the emperor with his direct income and authority. Many of these lands had been granted to powerful abbeys over centuries, often with clauses that granted the abbeys considerable autonomy and tax exemptions. Quedlinburg, established by Otto I as a family memorial and a center of imperial power, possessed huge swaths of land, castles, towns, and even its own military levies. Otto III, in his quest for a more centralized state, saw these ancient grants as potential obstacles to his vision. He dispatched imperial officials to inventory and, in some cases, demand the return of certain properties or the payment of new taxes that the abbey had historically been exempt from. Abbess Mathilde received the imperial mandates with a mixture of polite deference and steely determination. She understood the emperor's ambition, but she also knew the deep historical roots of Quedlinburg's privileges. The abbey's independence was not merely a matter of convenience. It was enshrined in charters granted by generations of emperors, including her own grandfather. These charters were not just pieces of parchment. They were legal documents that guaranteed the abbey's rights and autonomy, making it a powerful spiritual and temporal principality. To surrender these rights even to the emperor would be to betray her sacred trust and weaken the very foundation of her community. The abbess, rather than openly defy the emperor in a fit of rage, chose a path of calculated resistance. She instructed her monastic lawyers and scribes to meticulously gather all existing charters and grants. They compiled a detailed dossier outlining Quedlinburg's long history of imperial immediacy, its exemptions, and its vested rights. Mathilde then sent her most trusted representatives to the imperial court, not to refuse outright, but to present the abbey's case with irrefutable legal and historical arguments. They brought forth ancient seals and ornate script, demonstrating that Quedlinburg's status was not a mere custom but a legally binding arrangement. Otto III, busy with his grand schemes in Rome and his sometimes strained relations with the papacy, did not initially back down. He maintained his stance that some of the abbey's landholdings, particularly those that bordered other imperial territories he sought to integrate, were subject to his direct review. He suggested that Quedlinburg's unique position, while venerable, might need adjustment in the face of a unified imperial vision. He sent his own legal experts to Quedlinburg to cross-reference the abbey's claims against imperial records. This was a direct challenge to the abbess's authority and the abbey's perceived inviolability. What happened next was a lengthy and intricate dance of power. Abbess Mathilde refused to concede any ground on the core principles of Quedlinburg's autonomy. She leveraged her extensive network of connections within the imperial court and among the German nobility. Many powerful families had daughters within Quedlinburg, and many owed loyalty to the abbey or valued its stability as a regional power. Mathilde shrewdly reminded them that if the emperor could unilaterally revoke ancient privileges from one imperial abbey, he could do the same to any other powerful entity. This subtly rallied support for her cause, creating a quiet but firm opposition to any heavy-handed imperial intervention. She also appealed to the spiritual nature of her stand. Quedlinburg was not just a landholding. It was a sacred foundation, a place of prayer and learning, built to honor the imperial lineage. To diminish its independence was in a way to diminish the legacy of the emperors themselves. She emphasized that the abbey's wealth was used for charitable works, for the maintenance of scholarly pursuits, and for the spiritual welfare of the empire, not for personal gain. The standoff continued for several months. Otto III, facing multiple challenges across his vast empire and needing the cooperation of powerful ecclesiastical princes, eventually realized that a direct confrontation with Quedlinburg would be too costly, could not afford to alienate such a strategically important and historically significant institution, especially one with deep ties to his own family. Precedent of unilaterally overturning ancient charters also carried significant risks for his broader imperial authority. In the end, a compromise was reached. Otto III did not fully rescind his demands for a review of imperial domain, but he formally reaffirmed Quedlinburg's most crucial privileges and landholdings. He acknowledged the ancient charters and the abbey's long-standing imperial immediacy. While some minor administrative adjustments might have been made, the core of Quedlinburg's independence and its vast wealth remained intact. Abbess Mathilde, through her legal acumen, political skill, and quiet defiance, had successfully defended her abbey's sacred and temporal rights against the ambitions of a determined young emperor. Her stand ensured that Quedlinburg would continue to thrive as a powerful spiritual and political entity for centuries to come, a testament to the strength and resilience of a medieval abbess. Number 9. The Abbess of Fontevraud and the King's New Dominion. As the 12th century faded into the 13th, the political landscape of Western Europe was dramatically reshaped by the ambitions and conflicts of mighty monarchs. One of the most significant power shifts occurred between the English Plantagenet kings and the French Capetian monarchs. At the heart of this struggle, located in the Loire Valley, lay the Abbey of Fontevraud. This was no ordinary monastery. It was a unique double monastery, home to both monks and nuns, all under the spiritual and temporal authority of a powerful abbess. Fontevraud was also the revered burial place of some of England's most famous kings, including Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Richard the Lionheart. Its abbess, typically a woman of noble birth and immense influence, ruled over a vast network of priories and lands across France and England. By the turn of the 13th century, the Abbess of Fontevraud was Mathilde of Anjou. She was a woman of noble lineage, accustomed to dealing with the highest echelons of society. Her abbey's very existence was intertwined with the Plantagenet dynasty. However, her powerful patrons were facing a formidable adversary, King Philip II, Augustus of France. Philip II was a shrewd and ambitious ruler, systematically expanding his royal domain at the expense of his Plantagenet rivals. Through a combination of military victories, legal maneuvering, and strategic marriages, Philip began to chip away at the vast Anglo-Angevin Empire, eventually conquering Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine by 1204. These territories, including Fontevraud, now fell directly under the French crown. Change in overlordship posed a profound challenge to Fontevraud. For generations, the abbey had enjoyed the patronage and protection of the Plantagenets, who had showered it with gifts and confirmed its extensive privileges. Now a new king, whose ancestors had been their rivals, was in charge. Philip II Augustus, eager to assert his authority over his newly acquired lands, viewed Fontevraud not just as a religious institution but as a strategic asset. Its wealth was considerable, its lands extensive, and its network of priories spread far and wide. He was determined to integrate these new territories fully into the French royal domain, which often meant challenging long-standing local customs and asserting direct royal control over powerful institutions. The conflict brewed over several key issues. Philip II Augustus, asserting his new authority, sought to impose royal taxes on the abbey's lands, despite Fontevraud's historical exemptions, often granted by previous rulers. He also attempted to influence the appointment of senior officials within the abbey and its dependent priories, believing that as the new sovereign he had the right to ensure loyalty and obedience. Furthermore, the fact that Fontevraud was the burial place of his former enemies, the Plantagenets, likely made him even more eager to establish his undeniable sovereignty over the site. Abbess Mathilde, however, was not one to be easily cowed. She understood that surrendering Fontevraud's ancient privileges would not only diminish the abbey's power but also threaten its spiritual independence. The abbess knew the abbey's vast collection of charters and papal bulls inside and out. These documents detailed centuries of papal protection and royal grants that guaranteed Fontevraud's autonomy from external interference, including royal taxation and secular appointments. She viewed Philip's demands as a direct violation of these established rights. Her stand began with a clear, firm refusal to comply with the new royal demands for taxation and interference in internal abbey affairs. She cited the abbey's ancient charters, particularly those granted by the very Plantagenet kings, who now lay buried within its walls, which explicitly exempted Fontevraud from various royal levies. She also invoked the numerous papal bulls that placed Fontevraud under direct papal protection, meaning it was answerable primarily to the Pope, not to a secular king, in spiritual matters and often in temporal ones as well. Philip II Augustus was known for his legal acumen and his unwavering pursuit of royal power. He did not immediately back down. He dispatched royal commissioners and legal experts to Fontevraud to scrutinize its charters and to argue the case for royal prerogative. These commissioners demanded access to the abbey's financial records and asserted the king's right to oversee appointments, especially concerning the allocation of benefices, income-generating church offices. This was a direct attempt to undermine the abbess's authority and bring Fontevraud into the standard framework of French royal administration. What happened next was a protracted legal and political battle. Abbess Mathilde, rather than resorting to open rebellion, chose a sophisticated strategy of resistance. She rallied the support of her extensive monastic network, including the many priories dependent on Fontevraud throughout France and England. She corresponded with influential cardinals in Rome, emphasizing the abbey's papal protection and the threat posed by royal overreach to monastic freedom. She also engaged in careful diplomacy, appealing to the principles of justice and historical precedent that even kings were supposed to uphold. The abbess made it clear that while Fontevraud would acknowledge Philip II Augustus as its temporal overlord, it would not surrender its long-established rights and privileges. She argued that the abbey's spiritual mission and its ability to care for the poor and sick, as well as to maintain its significant library and scriptorium, depended on its financial autonomy. To tax the abbey arbitrarily would hinder its ability to perform its sacred duties. Philip II Augustus, despite his determination, faced practical limitations. He was a pragmatic king who understood the power of spiritual institutions and the importance of public opinion. He could not afford to be seen as a tyrannical ruler who trampled on ancient rights, especially of a renowned and respected abbey like Fontevraud. Furthermore, alienating the powerful monastic orders could lead to wider unrest and opposition from the Church, which was still a formidable force in medieval society. After months of negotiation, legal challenges, and diplomatic maneuvering, a pragmatic resolution began to take shape. Philip II Augustus, though perhaps not achieving all his initial aims, secured some concessions. Fontevraud formally recognized him as its temporal sovereign. However, the core of Fontevraud's extensive exemptions from royal taxation and its right to largely self-govern its internal affairs, particularly regarding the election of its abbess and the appointment of its officials, were largely reaffirmed. King had to acknowledge the abbey's powerful papal connections and its ancient charters. Abbess, through her steadfast defense and sophisticated legal strategy, had successfully safeguarded the abbey's autonomy. While Fontevraud became part of the French royal domain, it retained a unique and privileged status, a testament to Abbess Mathilde's strength and determination. Her stand ensured that Fontevraud continued to flourish as a spiritual and cultural beacon, its independence protected even as the world around it underwent massive political upheaval. Number 8. The Abbess of Las Huelgas and the King's Royal Prerogative. In the sun-drenched plains of Castile, in the heart of what is now Spain, stood the magnificent royal monastery of Las Huelgas. Founded in 1187 by King Alfonso VIII and his English wife Eleanor Plantagenet, daughter of Henry II, Las Huelgas was not just a convent, it was a veritable spiritual city. It served as the royal pantheon, the burial place for Castilian kings and queens, and held extraordinary privileges that made its abbess one of the most powerful women in Christendom. By the mid-13th century, the Abbess of Las Huelgas, an office typically held by a woman of royal or high noble birth, exercised quasi-episcopal powers over more than 50 dependent churches, priories, and hospitals. She collected tithes, appointed priests, and held secular jurisdiction over numerous towns and villages. Her authority was immense, often surpassing that of local bishops. The particular clash we are looking at involved Abbess Berenguela and King Ferdinand III of Castile, also known as Ferdinand the Saint. Ferdinand III was a formidable ruler, a great military leader who spearheaded the Reconquista, recapturing vast territories from the Moors and solidifying the Castilian monarchy. Like any ambitious king, he sought to centralize power and ensure the loyalty and obedience of all powerful institutions within his realm, including the mighty Abbey of Las Huelgas. The seeds of conflict lay in the very nature of Las Huelgas's foundation. While royal, it was endowed with privileges that made it remarkably independent. The abbess was practically a sovereign ruler within her domains. King Ferdinand III, perhaps seeing the abbey's extensive secular jurisdiction and vast wealth as a potential source of royal revenue or a challenge to his direct authority, began to scrutinize its extraordinary exemptions and powers. He sought to assert royal prerogative over aspects of the abbey's administration that had long been under the abbess's sole control. One of the specific flashpoints concerned the abbess's right to appoint clergy to the numerous churches under her jurisdiction. Traditionally, the abbess selected and presented candidates for these positions, a privilege usually reserved for bishops. King Ferdinand III, aiming to assert royal control over ecclesiastical appointments across his kingdom, began to challenge this long-standing right. He argued that royal authority should have a say in who served in positions of influence even within a royal foundation. This was not a minor disagreement. It went to the heart of the abbess's power and the abbey's independent status. Abbess Berenguela, a woman of sharp legal mind and unwavering resolve, would not allow the king to diminish the sacred privileges of her abbey. She understood that if the king could dictate appointments, it would open the door to further royal interference, potentially eroding all of Las Huelgas' unique autonomy. She knew the abbey's history, its royal charters, and its long-standing papal bulls. These documents clearly granted the abbess and her successors the right to appoint clergy, collect tithes, and exercise secular jurisdiction over her extensive lands. Her stand began with a firm refusal to comply with the king's demands. When the royal officials arrived, perhaps suggesting candidates or questioning the abbess's choices, Berenguela invoked the abbey's foundational charters. She produced the very documents signed by Ferdinand's own ancestors, including his grandfather, Alfonso VIII, which explicitly laid out Las Huelgas' extraordinary rights. She argued that these were not mere customs, but legally binding agreements that even a king could not unilaterally overturn. King Ferdinand III, known for his strong will and his insistence on royal authority, did not back down easily. He dispatched his own legal counsel to press the royal claims, arguing that royal prerogatives superseded even ancient grants, especially in matters affecting the spiritual welfare of the kingdom and the loyalty of the clergy. He threatened to withhold royal protection from the abbey or to challenge its privileges in ecclesiastical courts if the abbess did not yield. He might have even suggested that the immense wealth of Las Huelgas could be better utilized for the kingdom's needs, such as the ongoing Reconquista efforts. What happened next was a complex and drawn-out legal and diplomatic struggle. Abbess Berenguela did not resort to armed rebellion, but she leveraged every resource at her disposal. She rallied the support of the Castilian nobility, many of whom had family members within Las Huelgas or owed loyalty to the abbey. She reminded them of the abbey's sacred status as a royal pantheon and a symbol of Castilian piety. Any attack on its privileges could be seen as an attack on the kingdom's spiritual foundations. Crucially, Abbess Berenguela appealed directly to the papacy. Las Huelgas, like many powerful monasteries, enjoyed direct papal protection, meaning it could bypass local bishops and appeal directly to Rome. This was a powerful tool against royal overreach. The abbess sent envoys to the papal court, presenting her case and emphasizing that the king's actions represented an infringement on ecclesiastical liberties. The papacy, always eager to assert its own authority over secular rulers, listened carefully. The papacy, through its legates, generally sided with the abbess, affirming the principle that monastic institutions had the right to self-governance as granted by their founders and the Holy See. They reminded King Ferdinand that while he was a powerful and pious monarch, even kings were subject to ecclesiastical law and the ancient rights of the Church. Church was wary of any precedent that would allow secular rulers to arbitrarily seize control of church appointments or revenues. Ferdinand III, despite his military successes and his strong sense of royal destiny, was also a deeply religious man. He understood the power of the Church and the spiritual consequences of open conflict with such a prominent and papal-backed institution. He needed the Church's support for his ongoing Rockenstock campaigns, which were often framed as holy wars. Alienating the papacy and powerful monasteries like Las Huelgas would undermine his spiritual authority and potentially lead to widespread dissent. In the end, after a period of intense negotiation and papal intervention, a compromise was reached. King Ferdinand III largely conceded on the abbess's right to appoint clergy to her dependent churches, though perhaps with a commitment to ensure the loyalty of those appointed. He recognized the ancient privileges of Las Huelgas, reaffirming its unique status and its extensive autonomy. While the king probably secured some nominal recognition of his overarching sovereignty, the core of the abbess's quasi-episcopal powers and her control over the abbey's vast estates remained firmly intact. Abbess Berenguela's stand was a resounding success. Through her legal astuteness, her diplomatic skill, and her unwavering defense of ancient rights, She ensured that Las Huelgas continued to operate as an independent and immensely powerful spiritual principality within the Castilian kingdom. Her actions served as a powerful reminder that even in an age of strong kings, the spiritual authority and established legal rights of formidable women religious could successfully challenge royal prerogative. Number 7. The Abbess of Shaftesbury and King John's unending demands. Early 13th century in England was a tumultuous period, dominated by the deeply unpopular reign of King John. His misrule, his heavy taxation, his conflicts with the English barons, and his disastrous war with France over his continental territories all created an environment of widespread instability and resentment. Amidst this chaos, one of England's wealthiest and most prestigious nunneries, Shaftesbury Abbey, found itself repeatedly at odds with the king's relentless demands for money. Shaftesbury, founded by King Alfred the Great, was a royal foundation with a long history of receiving royal patronage, yet its wealth made it a tempting target for a king constantly in need of funds. At the time, the Abbess of Shaftesbury was Agnes de Fer. She was a woman of noble birth, experienced in the administration of a vast estate and the spiritual leadership of a large community of nuns. Shaftesbury owned extensive lands across several counties, generating significant income from rents, agricultural produce, and various feudal dues. It was a major economic powerhouse, and its abbesses were known for their administrative capabilities. King John's reign was characterized by a chronic shortage of money. He lost most of England's continental possessions, requiring constant military campaigns and leading to financial ruin. To fund his wars and maintain his lifestyle, John resorted to increasingly oppressive and arbitrary forms of taxation. He extracted scutage from his barons, payments in lieu of military service, seized lands, sold offices, and levied heavy taxes on the church. Monasteries, with their visible wealth, were prime targets for royal demands. The specific point of contention between King John and Abbess Agnes revolved around extraordinary financial levies. John repeatedly demanded aids and gifts from the church, often far beyond customary feudal dues. These were not traditional taxes, but rather forced contributions, sometimes framed as loans that were rarely repaid. For Shaftesbury, this meant royal agents arriving at the abbey gates demanding a substantial sum of money, often with little notice and no justification other than the king's immediate need. Abbess Agnes understood the king's desperation, but she also knew her responsibility to her community and to the long-term solvency of the abbey. Shaftesbury's wealth was not hoarded. It was used to maintain the monastic buildings, support the nuns, provide for the poor and sick in the surrounding communities, and contribute to various charitable and educational endeavors. Arbitrary and excessive royal demands threatened the abbey's ability to fulfill its sacred mission and maintain its large establishment. Her stand against King John was not a dramatic confrontation in a battlefield, but a persistent and carefully managed resistance to his financial exploitation. When royal mandates for extraordinary sums arrived, Abbess Agnes did not immediately send the requested funds. Instead, she employed a strategy of delay, negotiation, and appeal. She would send letters to the royal chancery, detailing the abbey's existing financial burdens, citing the abbey's ancient charters that granted specific exemptions from royal taxation, and gently reminding the king of Shaftesbury's royal foundation and its contributions to the kingdom's spiritual welfare. King John, notoriously short-tempered and accustomed to getting his way through intimidation, reacted with frustration and increased pressure. He dispatched more insistent messengers, sometimes accompanied by royal sheriffs, to underscore the seriousness of his demands. He threatened the abbey with various forms of royal displeasure, such as the imposition of custody over its lands, meaning royal officials would take over its administration and revenues, or the refusal of royal writs and legal protection. He even used the leverage of the abbess's upcoming election. Traditionally, a royal confirmation was required for an abbess to take office. To try and force compliance, What happened next was a prolonged period of cat and mouse. Abbess Agnes, however, was shrewd. She understood John's financial desperation and his need to maintain at least a semblance of legitimacy, even if his methods were tyrannical. She did not outright refuse to pay anything, as that would invite immediate and severe royal retribution. Instead, she would offer a lower sum than demanded, presenting it as a voluntary gift rather than a compulsory tax, thereby subtly preserving the abbey's exemption status. She would also delay payment, arguing that the abbey needed time to liquidate assets or gather funds. This delay itself was a form of passive resistance, frustrating the king's immediate financial needs. She also leveraged the network of powerful barons and bishops who were increasingly dissatisfied with John's rule. Many of these figures had connections to Shaftesbury or respected its position. While they might not openly defy the king on the abbey's behalf, their general opposition to John's methods created a climate where his demands were less likely to be met with immediate and total obedience. The abbess's measured resistance became part of the broader pattern of resistance to John's tyranny that eventually led to Magna Carta. John, despite his bluster, could not afford to completely cripple one of England's most important religious institutions. While he extracted significant sums from Shaftesbury over the years, he never succeeded in fully breaking its financial independence or completely overturning its ancient privileges. The abbey suffered certainly, but it endured. The records show repeated instances of royal demands and subsequent payments, but often at negotiated lower rates or with significant delays. Abbess Agnes's quiet but firm stand helped to preserve the abbey's long-term viability and spiritual mission. Her strategy of diplomatic engagement, legal argument, and strategic delay rather than outright confrontation was effective against a king who, despite his absolute claims, was increasingly isolated. Her actions contributed to the broader narrative of institutional resistance that ultimately constrained King John's arbitrary power. The abbey survived John's reign, its fundamental rights largely intact, thanks to the persistent defiance of its abbess. Number 6. The Abbess of Romsey and Henry III's patronage games. The mid-13th century saw England under the long reign of King Henry III, a monarch known for his piety, his artistic patronage, and his often strained relations with his barons. While he was a more stable ruler than his father, King John Henry III still faced constant financial pressures, exacerbated by his ambitious building projects, his lavish court, and his persistent attempts to reclaim lost territories in France. Romsey Abbey, located in Hampshire, was another ancient and wealthy royal nunnery, holding extensive lands and enjoying royal favor, often leading to clashes when the king sought to exert his influence or extract resources. This particular time, the Abbess of Romsey was Eleanor de Souligny. She was a woman from a prominent Anglo-Norman family, chosen to lead this significant community. Romsey, like Shaftesbury, was a prime example of a royal foundation, meaning the king had a special interest in its affairs, often expecting to exercise certain rights of patronage, particularly concerning elections and financial contribution. The specific point of contention arose from King Henry III's attempts to interfere directly in the internal affairs of Romsey Abbey, specifically regarding the election of its abbesses and the admission of nuns. While it was customary for the king to grant a license to elect and then confirm the chosen candidate, Henry III, burdened by debts and often influenced by his own preferences and foreign relatives, often sought to exert more direct control. He would sometimes pressure convents to elect a specific candidate who was politically useful to him, or to admit women into the community who were his favored relatives or noble dependents, even if they did not meet the abbey's strict monastic criteria, or if the abbey was already full. Abbess Eleanor de Souligny viewed these royal pressures as a clear infringement on the abbey's spiritual autonomy and its established customs. The right of the community to freely elect its own spiritual leader was a foundational principle of monastic life. Similarly, the ability to control admissions ensured that only suitable candidates committed to the monastic rule entered the community, preserving its spiritual integrity and its financial stability. To allow the king to impose his will in these matters would be to compromise the very essence of Romsey Abbey. Her stand was firm and principled. When royal letters arrived, suggesting or even demanding the election of a particular candidate or the admission of a number of women, Abbess Eleanor responded with polite but unyielding resistance. She would cite the abbey's ancient charters, which affirmed the community's right to free election. She would also explain that the abbey's capacity was limited or that the suggested candidates did not meet the rigorous spiritual requirements for monastic life at Romsey. She made it clear that while she honored the king, her primary duty was to God and to the strict observance of her monastic rule. King Henry III, often portrayed as more pious than his father, was still a strong believer in his royal prerogative. He was accustomed to exercising considerable influence over religious institutions, particularly those that were royal foundations. He reacted with frustration and the exercise of royal pressure. He might delay granting the license to elect or withhold his confirmation of a freely chosen abbess, leaving the community in an uncertain state. He might also threaten to impose a royal custodian on the abbey, effectively taking over its administration until his demands were met. Forcing the abbey into royal custody meant the king would extract revenues, appoint officials, and essentially run the abbey for his own benefit, a devastating blow to its autonomy. What happened next was a carefully negotiated power play. Abbess Eleanor and the convent, advised by their legal counsel, understood that outright defiance was dangerous. Instead, they relied on their moral authority, their adherence to canon law, and their ability to appeal to a wider network of ecclesiastical support. They corresponded with the local bishop and, if necessary, appealed to the Archbishop of Canterbury or even the Pope. The Church generally was wary of secular interference in monastic elections and admissions, seeing it as a threat to ecclesiastical liberties. The abbess and her community would consistently present their case, emphasizing the spiritual harm that would come from royal interference. They argued that a coerced election or the admission of unsuitable candidates would undermine discipline, lead to corruption, and ultimately harm the religious life of the convent. They made it clear that their resistance was not a sign of disloyalty to the king, but a matter of religious principle. Henry III, despite his persistence, eventually had to yield, at least in part. He often faced similar opposition from other powerful monastic institutions and the broader English Church. He could not afford to be seen as constantly at odds with the religious establishment, especially given his own piety and his reliance on clerical support for his administration. While he might have successfully placed a few favored women into Romsey over the years, the core right of the community to elect its abbess freely and to control its admissions process largely remained intact. Royal records often show that while Henry made demands, the abbey frequently succeeded in delaying or mitigating their impact, often by paying a fee or fine to the king in exchange for a concession on his part. Abbess Eleanor's consistent and principled stand ensured that Romsey Abbey largely retained its independent governance. Her actions highlighted the significant moral and legal leverage that powerful medieval abbesses could wield against royal authority, even when facing a king determined to assert his will. Her steadfast defense of monastic autonomy served as a powerful example of how conviction and careful negotiation could preserve spiritual integrity in the face of secular pressure. Number 5. The Abbess of Barking and Edward I's taxation net. The late 13th century in England was defined by the long and often glorious reign of King Edward I, known as Longshanks or the Hammer of the Scots. He was a powerful and ambitious king, a skilled legislator, a military innovator, and a ruler determined to assert royal authority over all aspects of his kingdom. To fund his extensive legal reforms, his impressive castle-building projects, and his relentless wars against Wales and Scotland, Edward I needed vast sums of money. This led him to cast a wide net for taxation, often targeting the church, including its wealthiest monastic institutions. Barking Abbey, located just east of London, was one of England's oldest and most prestigious nunneries, dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period. It was immensely wealthy, holding vast estates and exercising significant feudal rights. At this time, the Abbess of Barking was Isabella de Foix, a woman of high social standing and considerable administrative skill. As one of the most powerful women in England, she managed a large household, oversaw complex financial administration, and governed a community of hundreds of nuns and lay servants. Barking Abbey's wealth and prominence made it an obvious target for Edward I's ambitious financial schemes. Primary point of contention between King Edward I and Abbess Isabella revolved around royal demands for extraordinary financial contributions. Edward I, more systematically than his predecessors, sought to regularize and increase royal revenues. He levied a series of new taxes, including tenths, a tenth of all movable goods, and fifteenths, a fifteenth of all movable goods, which he demanded from both lay and ecclesiastical subjects. While the Church generally agreed to some taxation for national defense, Edward's demands were often unprecedented in their frequency and scale, and he expected wealthy institutions like Barking to contribute generously. Abbess Isabella, like many ecclesiastical leaders, understood that some contribution to the crown was necessary, especially in times of war. However, she also knew that the Abbey's resources were for its spiritual mission, its charitable work, and the upkeep of its extensive properties. Excessive and arbitrary taxation could cripple the Abbey, undermining its ability to sustain its community and fulfill its duties. The Abbey also held ancient charters and privileges that had historically granted it various exemptions from royal levies. Edward I, however, was less inclined to respect ancient privileges when they stood in the way of his royal needs. Her stand began with a series of careful appeals and negotiations. When the royal writ demanding a substantial sum arrived, Abbess Isabella did not openly defy the king. Instead, she dispatched representatives to the royal chancery and the king's council, presenting Barking's case. She cited the Abbey's venerable history, its status as a royal foundation, and its ancient charters, which demonstrated its specific exemptions from certain taxes. She also highlighted the significant charitable works undertaken by the Abbey, arguing that its wealth was already serving the common good. King Edward I, a formidable legal mind and a relentless administrator, did not take such arguments lightly. He was known for his firm adherence to royal prerogative and his willingness to use legal and administrative pressure to enforce his will. He likely reacted with a demand for stricter accounting, questioning the Abbey's reported revenues and expenditures. He sent royal officials to conduct inquiries into the Abbey's financial status, effectively auditing its books and challenging its claims of exemption. He might also have threatened the abbess with the king's displeasure, or the imposition of royal custody over the Abbey's temporalities, which would have meant the king's agents taking direct control of the Abbey's income and property. What happened next was a persistent legal and administrative struggle. Abbess Isabella, advised by her stewards and legal counsel, maintained her position. She continued to present detailed financial accounts and historical arguments, emphasizing that the Abbey's resources were not limitless and that excessive taxation would lead to its ruin. She also leveraged the Abbey's powerful connections within the English nobility and the church. Many noble families had daughters at Barking, and they held the Abbey in high regard. The Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior clergy, were also generally supportive of monastic liberties against excessive royal demands. The abbess's strategy was not one of outright rebellion, but of strategic engagement and delay. She understood that Edward I, for all his power, still operated within a framework of legal and customary norms. While he pushed the boundaries, he preferred to do so through legal means rather than naked force. Barking Abbey, with its vast records and skilled administrators, was able to present a robust legal defense. The arguments centered on the principle that royal grants once given should be honored, and that arbitrary taxation, especially of a religious institution, was an infringement on church liberties. The outcome was a series of compromises and ongoing negotiations. While Edward I did succeed in extracting significant sums from Barking Abbey over the years, often in the form of voluntary gifts or loans that were rarely repaid, he was not able to completely dismantle its financial independence or unilaterally revoke all its ancient exemptions. The abbess and her community consistently pushed back, often paying less than the original demand, or negotiating for staggered payments. The records show that Barking, like many other powerful monastic institutions, bore a heavy financial burden under Edward I, but it managed to survive and retain its core autonomy. Abbess Isabella's persistent, legally minded resistance ensured that Barking Abbey, despite facing one of England's most powerful and demanding kings, remained a formidable and financially viable institution. Her stand demonstrated that, even against a king as determined as Edward I, a powerful abbess, armed with legal precedent and a strong administrative backbone, could successfully navigate the treacherous waters of royal taxation. Number 4. Hildegard of Bingen and the Emperor's interdict. In the mid-12th century, during a period of intense intellectual and spiritual ferment, the Rhineland in the Holy Roman Empire was home to one of history's most extraordinary women, Hildegard of Bingen. A visionary, mystic, composer, writer, natural scientist, and political advisor, Hildegard was far more than just an abbess. She corresponded with popes, emperors, kings, and bishops, offering spiritual guidance and often stern admonitions. Her authority stemmed from her widely recognized prophetic visions and her profound intellect. Her convent, first at Dissebodenberg and later at Rubertsberg, near Bingen, was a center of spiritual and intellectual life. The Holy Roman Emperor at the time was Frederick I, known as Frederick Barbarossa, a powerful and ambitious ruler determined to reassert imperial authority across his vast domains. Barbarossa was frequently embroiled in conflicts with the papacy over the control of the church and the right to appoint bishops and abbots. The investiture controversy, though largely resolved, still echoed. While Hildegard's primary conflicts were often with local bishops or the Archbishop of Mainz, her resistance to a powerful interdict directly challenged the implicit authority of the emperor, who often supported the secular enforcement of such ecclesiastical punishments. The specific conflict arose when Hildegard, upholding the sanctity of consecrated ground and the rights of her community, defied an interdict placed on her convent by the Archbishop of Mainz. Interdict was imposed because Hildegard had allowed a young nobleman, a former knight, who had been excommunicated, to be buried in the consecrated cemetery of her Rupertsberg convent. This knight, before his death, had sought reconciliation and received the last rites, but his excommunication had not been formally lifted by the archbishop. When the archbishop learned of the burial, he was furious. He demanded that the body be disinterred from the consecrated ground, viewing it as a sacrilege and a direct challenge to his episcopal authority. Hildegard, however, refused. She maintained that the knight had genuinely repented and received absolution before his death, making his burial in sacred ground permissible in God's eyes. She claimed to have received a vision that confirmed her stance. To obey the archbishop's command to disinter the body would be to violate a divine command and betray the deceased's final peace. Because of her defiance, the Archbishop of Mainz placed an interdict on her convent. An interdict was a devastating spiritual punishment. It meant that no divine services, mass, sacraments like communion, confession, baptisms, or burials could be performed within the convent, and the nuns were forbidden from singing the divine office. It was a spiritual death sentence for a monastic community. While the interdict was issued by the archbishop, such severe ecclesiastical punishments often received implicit or explicit support from secular rulers, as the Church relied on temporal power to enforce its decrees. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, though he admired Hildegard and had corresponded with her previously, was typically aligned with the archbishop in matters of ecclesiastical order and the enforcement of church law, especially when it strengthened secular authority. To defy the archbishop was, in a way, to defy the established order that the emperor sought to maintain. Hildegard's stand was a powerful act of spiritual defiance against established ecclesiastical and, by extension, imperial authority. She firmly refused to disinter the body, citing her visions and her spiritual conviction. She defended her actions in letters and through her emissaries, arguing that the archbishop's decision was unjust and that she was merely following God's will, which superseded human law. She also explained that her refusal to comply was not out of disrespect, but out of a profound spiritual duty. The Archbishop of Mainz reacted with immediate and severe enforcement. The interdict was imposed, silencing the convent's beloved liturgical singing, a central part of their daily life and spiritual practice. This was a profound and deeply painful punishment for the nuns. The archbishop also sent emissaries to the imperial court, seeking to ensure that Emperor Frederick Barbarossa would support the enforcement of the interdict and not intervene on Hildegard's behalf. What happened next was a testament to Hildegard's unique spiritual authority and her unyielding spirit. Despite the severe spiritual hardship, Hildegard and her community endured the interdict. She continued to write letters and dispatch messengers, explaining her rationale and pleading her case to various ecclesiastical and secular authorities, including, indirectly, to the imperial court. She argued passionately for the justice of her cause, even asserting that God himself would be displeased if she obeyed an unjust order. She also used her considerable rhetorical skill to remind those in power of the spiritual dangers of arbitrary authority. Crucially, Hildegard's reputation as a true visionary and a saintly figure worked in her favor. She had a long history of spiritual integrity, and her visions were widely accepted as authentic by many, including the papacy. This made it difficult for her opponents to simply dismiss her as a rebellious nun. Many powerful figures, including some within Emperor Barbarossa's circle, were wary of crossing a woman believed to be a direct recipient of divine revelations. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, while not directly involved in the initial imposition of the interdict, was well aware of the controversy surrounding Hildegard. He had previously consulted with her and valued her spiritual wisdom. He understood the potential implications of a prolonged conflict with such a prominent religious figure, especially one whose prophecies often carried political weight. While he typically supported his archbishops, he also valued stability and the smooth functioning of his empire. A protracted public dispute with a renowned mystic could prove counterproductive. Eventually, due to Hildegard's unwavering stand, her persistent appeals, and likely the growing pressure from concerned spiritual and secular leaders, the Archbishop of Mainz began to reconsider. He sent a delegation to Rupertsberg to investigate Hildegard's claims more thoroughly. After hearing her testimony and that of the convent, and likely realizing the potential for further spiritual and political embarrassment, the Archbishop ultimately lifted the interdict. He recognized that while the knight had been excommunicated, his final confession and repentance, as attested by Hildegard, provided grounds for divine mercy. Hildegard's steadfast refusal to yield, driven by her spiritual convictions, ultimately triumphed over both archiepiscopal authority and the implicit secular power that enforced. The episode cemented her reputation as a fearless defender of spiritual truth, and a woman who would not compromise her conscience even in the face of immense pressure from the highest powers in the land. Her convent was restored to its full spiritual life, and Hildegard continued her prolific work, her authority only enhanced by her courageous stand. Number 3. The Nuns of Chelles and Philip I's royal patronage. In the late 11th century, in the heartland of the Capetian kingdom of France, stood the ancient and venerable Abbey of Chelles. Situated close to Paris, it was one of the most significant royal nunneries in the kingdom, with a history stretching back to the Merovingian queens. Its abbess held considerable temporal power, controlling vast estates and exercising significant jurisdiction over a large network of dependent priories and villages. Chelles was not merely a spiritual retreat, it was a powerful economic and social institution, attracting noble women and enjoying direct royal patronage. King at this time was Philip I. His reign was long and complex, marked by personal scandals, especially his controversial marriage to Bertrade of Montfort, while his first wife was still alive, ongoing conflicts with the papacy, leading to a papal interdict on France for a time, and his efforts to consolidate royal authority within his still developing kingdom. Like many medieval kings, Philip I saw royal abbeys not just as places of prayer, but as sources of patronage, potential revenue, and positions for his favored relatives or political allies. The specific point of contention with the Nuns of Chelles arose over royal attempts to exert direct influence over the abbey's internal affairs, particularly concerning the appointment of the abbess and the selection of new entrants to the community. Philip I, keen to expand his royal reach and consolidate his power, sometimes sought to impose his favored candidates for abbess or to demand the admission of women from noble families that he wished to reward or appease, regardless of the community's own preferences or monastic rules. He might also have attempted to levy special gifts or services from the abbey, seeing its wealth as a resource for the crown. The Abbess of Chelles, whose name might be lost to precise records for this specific early period of conflict, nevertheless represented the long-standing tradition of monastic autonomy at Chelles. She knew that the abbey as a royal foundation had certain obligations to the crown, but also possessed ancient charters and papal privileges that guaranteed its internal governance, including the right to free election of its abbess and control over its admissions. To surrender these rights would be to compromise the abbey's spiritual integrity and its independence from secular interference. The nuns' stand began with a collective assertion of their rights, led by their abbess. When royal messengers arrived, bearing letters from Philip I, attempting to dictate a choice for a new abbess, or demanding the admission of a specific number of women, the community would respectfully but firmly refuse. They would cite their monastic rule, their long-standing customs, and, most importantly, the charters granted by previous kings and confirmed by popes, which enshrined their right to elect their own spiritual leader and to manage their own admissions. They stressed that their duty was first and foremost to God and to the observance of their rule. King Philip I, despite his personal struggles with the Church, was still a Capetian king, attempting to assert his authority. He reacted to the nuns' resistance with various forms of royal pressure. He might delay granting the necessary royal license for an election, effectively leaving the abbey without a fully recognized head. He could also refuse to confirm an abbess, freely chosen by the community, forcing a re-election. He might threaten the abbey with royal custody, a measure that would place the abbey's temporal assets under royal administration until the king's demands were met. Effectively seizing its revenues, what happened next was a delicate balancing act of power. The abbess and her community, advised by their ecclesiastical superiors, such as the Archbishop of Sens, who oversaw the diocese, engaged in careful diplomacy. They would send their own representatives to the royal court, patiently explaining their position, citing the sanctity of monastic vows, and reminding the king of the spiritual consequences of violating the Church's liberties. They also appealed to higher ecclesiastical authorities, including the papacy, which was always keen to uphold the freedom of the Church from secular interference, especially during a time when Philip I himself was under papal censure for his marital affairs. The Nuns of Chelles used their moral authority and their deep connections within the French nobility. Many noble families had daughters in the abbey, and these families would be invested in preserving the abbey's independence and reputation. The broader church also viewed such royal interference with suspicion, as it set a dangerous precedent for all religious houses. Philip I, facing multiple challenges, including papal excommunication for his marriage and persistent efforts to solidify his rule, was not in a position to engage in a prolonged and damaging conflict with a powerful and well-connected abbey like Chelles. While he might have achieved some minor concessions or extracted some gifts over time, he generally found himself unable to completely overturn the abbey's established rights. The records indicate that while royal influence was often exerted, Chelles largely maintained its control over internal elections and admissions, often through careful negotiation or by paying a financial sum to the king to maintain their privileges. The abbess and the nuns of Chelles, through their persistent and principled stand, demonstrated that even against a demanding king in a consolidating monarchy, powerful religious communities could successfully defend their autonomy. Their collective resolve ensured that Chelles Abbey continued to thrive as an independent spiritual and temporal powerhouse, a testament to the enduring strength of medieval monastic traditions against royal encroachment. Number 2. The Nuns of St. Mary's, Winchester, and King Stephen's Anarchy. The mid-12th century in England plunged into a devastating civil war known as the Anarchy. Following the death of King Henry I without a clear male heir, his nephew Stephen of Blois seized the throne, but his claim was immediately challenged by Henry I's daughter, Empress Mathilde. This ignited a brutal two-decade conflict marked by widespread lawlessness, shifting allegiances and constant warfare between the supporters of Stephen and Mathilde. In this chaotic environment, powerful religious houses, often caught between warring factions, had to navigate perilous waters. One such institution was St. Mary's Abbey, Winchester, a wealthy and influential royal nunnery located in the heart of the old Anglo-Saxon capital. At this time, the Abbess of St. Mary's, Winchester, was Isabella. She oversaw a thriving community and substantial landholdings, all vulnerable to the depredations of war. Winchester itself was a key strategic city, frequently besieged and changing hands between the opposing sides. The abbey, with its valuable resources and strategic location, became a natural target for both royal and baronial demands. The specific point of contention arose from the constant demands made by King Stephen and his forces, or by the Empress Mathilde's forces when they controlled Winchester, for financial contributions, provisions, and lodging. Both sides were desperate for resources to fund their war efforts. Monasteries, with their accumulated wealth and secure buildings, were often seen as ready sources of supply. This meant royal officials or military commanders would arrive at the abbey gates, demanding food for their armies, fodder for their horses, or even demanding that the abbey's buildings be used for billeting troops. Abbess Isabella and her community knew that outright refusal could lead to plunder and destruction, a fate many other religious houses suffered during the anarchy. However, constantly yielding to demands would deplete the abbey's resources, rendering it unable to sustain its community or fulfill its charitable obligations. It would also set a dangerous precedent, inviting more demands. The abbey had ancient charters granting it certain immunities, but these were often ignored in the brutal realities of civil war. Her stand was one of careful negotiation and strategic resistance, designed to protect her community and its assets without inviting total ruin. When King Stephen's men arrived demanding provisions or funds, Abbess Isabella did not slam the gates shut. Instead, she would engage in parleys, attempting to negotiate a lower sum than demanded or offering a partial contribution, pleading poverty or the abbey's existing burdens. She would emphasize the abbey's spiritual status, and its role as a place of prayer for the king and the kingdom, subtly invoking the spiritual consequences of harming such a sacred institution. King Stephen, embroiled in a desperate struggle for survival, would react with frustration and a show of force. He might send more heavily armed detachments or threaten the use of military coercion. He knew that monasteries had wealth, and in the anarchy, such resources were vital. He might also attempt to seize control of some of the abbey's external properties or income if the abbess proved too unyielding. The reality of the anarchy meant that royal authority was often tenuous, and demands were often backed by immediate force. What happened next was a constant ebb and flow of pressure and resistance. Abbess Isabella, through her shrewd management and the protection offered by the abbey's spiritual standing, navigated these treacherous waters. She leveraged the abbey's extensive network of contacts both within the church and among the local nobility, many of whom were invested in the abbey's survival. She also played a delicate game of neutrality, striving to maintain good relations with both sides where possible, even as Winchester itself changed hands multiple times. The abbess and her community were not always successful in fending off demands entirely. The records from the period often show monasteries experiencing financial distress and some losses due to the constant expropriations. However, St. Mary's Winchester largely avoided the complete destruction or systematic plunder that befell many other institutions. Abbess Isabella's strategy of pragmatic resistance and negotiation rather than open defiance was crucial. She would yield just enough to avoid complete ruin. While fighting to protect the core assets and independence of the abbey, her stand also included subtle acts of defiance. If troops were billeted, she would ensure they were kept separate from the conventual enclosure. If provisions were given, she would ensure receipts were issued, hinting at future accountability. She and her nuns would double down on their spiritual duties, believing that prayer and piety offered a form of divine protection against the chaos of the world. In the end, St. Mary's Winchester emerged from the anarchy, bruised but unbroken. Substantial endowments and the resilience of its abbess ensured its survival. Abbess Isabella's persistent, nuanced resistance demonstrated how even in the most chaotic of times, a determined abbess could defend her community against the relentless demands of a king fighting for his crown. Her actions were a powerful testament to the enduring strength and adaptability of medieval women religious in the face of overwhelming secular pressure. Number 1. The Abbess of Gandersheim and Emperor Henry V's authority. The early 12th century in the Holy Roman Empire was dominated by the investiture controversy, a decades-long struggle between emperors and popes over the right to appoint bishops and abbots. This conflict was not just about spiritual authority. It was deeply political, as bishops and abbots controlled vast lands and significant military resources. The outcome of these appointments directly impacted the power of both the papacy and the emperor. Amidst this epic struggle, the powerful imperial abbey of Gandersheim in Saxony, one of the oldest and most prestigious convents in the empire, found itself directly in the crosshairs. This critical juncture, the Abbess of Gandersheim was Otto. She was a woman of noble lineage, well versed in the intricate politics of the empire and the church. Gandersheim was an imperial abbey, meaning its abbess was a prince of the empire holding extensive temporal rights and reporting directly to the emperor. This unique status, however, also meant that the emperor took a keen interest in its affairs, particularly in the election of its abbess. The specific point of contention between Abbess Otto and Emperor Henry V centered directly on the investiture controversy. Henry V, like his father Henry IV before him, staunchly defended the imperial right to appoint bishops and abbots with their symbols of office, granting them temporal authority. Papacy, on the other hand, insisted that only the church could confer spiritual authority and that secular rulers should not interfere in ecclesiastical appointments. The election of an abbess at a powerful imperial abbey like Gandersheim was therefore not just a local church matter. It was a highly charged political event, directly testing the balance of power between emperor and pope. Emperor Henry V, determined to assert his imperial prerogative, sought to directly influence the election of Abbess Oda, or to impose a royal candidate, perhaps one more amenable to his policies. He saw control over such a powerful institution as crucial for consolidating his authority in Saxony, a region that often chafed under imperial rule. He would likely have sent imperial representatives to Gandersheim during the election process, attempting to sway the votes of the monastic chapter or to declare a preferred candidate. Abbess Oda, representing the traditional rights and spiritual independence of Gandersheim, firmly resisted. She understood that accepting a royally imposed abbess would be a profound betrayal of the abbey's ancient privileges and its spiritual freedom. The right of free election, where the community chose its own leader under the guidance of God, was a fundamental tenet of monasticism and a fiercely defended right during the investiture controversy. To yield on this point would be to set a dangerous precedent, subjugating the abbey to secular control. Her stand was clear and unyielding. When imperial mandates or suggestions arrived, Abbess Oda, supported by her chapter, asserted the abbey's right to free election. She cited the numerous imperial charters granted by previous emperors, which affirmed Gandersheim's special status and its right to elect its own abbess without undue secular interference. She also appealed to the principles of canon law, which stipulated that ecclesiastical appointments should be made freely by the church, not by lay rulers. Emperor Henry V, a strong-willed monarch who had even imprisoned the Pope at one point to extract concessions on investiture, reacted with immediate and forceful pressure. He would refuse to grant the necessary royal confirmation for the abbess chosen by the community, effectively invalidating the election. He might also threaten to impose a royal custodian on the abbey, seizing its temporalities and revenues until his will was obeyed. He could also use his influence to rally support for his preferred candidate among some factions within the monastic community or among the local nobility. What happened next was a protracted and bitter struggle that epitomized the wider investiture controversy. Abbess Oda did not resort to arms, but she mobilized all the spiritual and legal resources at her disposal. She appealed directly to the papacy, which saw Gandersheim's struggle as a crucial battle in the broader fight for ecclesiastical liberty. Papal legates were dispatched to support the abbess and to condemn imperial interference in elections. The abbess and her community also leveraged their powerful network of family connections within the German aristocracy, many of whom were ambivalent about the emperor's aggressive policies or were sympathetic to the church's stance. The abbess and her community engaged in intense legal arguments and diplomatic maneuvers. They reiterated that their resistance was not disloyalty to the emperor, but fidelity to God and to the ancient rights of their foundation. They emphasized that forcing an election would lead to spiritual disorder and ultimately undermine the piety of the empire. The struggle at Gandersheim became a symbol of the broader conflict, drawing attention from across Europe. Emperor Henry V, despite his powerful position, found himself increasingly constrained. The papacy, with its spiritual authority, could excommunicate him and his supporters, which carried immense weight in a deeply religious age. Furthermore, a prolonged conflict with a powerful and well-connected imperial abbey like Gandersheim could alienate important factions within the German nobility and undermine his authority. The very foundation of his legitimacy rested in part on his relationship with the Church. In the end, after years of deadlock and negotiation, a crucial compromise was reached in 1122 with the Concordat of Worms. While not directly about Gandersheim, this agreement resolved the wider investiture controversy by distinguishing between the spiritual and temporal aspects of ecclesiastical office. It stipulated that emperors would no longer invest bishops and abbots with ring and staff, symbols of spiritual authority, but they could be present at elections and invest them with their temporal possessions by touch of the scepter. For Gandersheim, this meant that while the emperor retained a role in confirming the abbess and granting her temporalities, the fundamental right of the community to freely elect its own leader was upheld. Abbess Otto's steadfast resistance, mirroring the broader struggle between the papacy and the empire, played a significant role in solidifying the principle of free elections for powerful religious houses. Her stand ensured that Gandersheim, one of the most powerful convents in the empire, maintained its essential independence and spiritual autonomy, leaving a lasting legacy of monastic freedom.